The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
In a major speech yesterday, Russia's president made sweeping claims and walked away from a key arms treaty. Tonight, details of what Putin said on this, the eve of the one-year anniversary of his country's invasion of Ukraine. Then, Canadian permanent residents aren't becoming citizens at the rates they once did. We'll ask why not. And Steve Paikin talks to author Cheryl Thompson about her upcoming book on the disturbing history of blackface in Canada, on stage and beyond. It's Wednesday, February 22nd, and that's all ahead on the agenda. U.S. President Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine this past weekend to reiterate his support for their war effort with both military and moral support. Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his State of the Nation address Tuesday, suspended its participation in key arms treaty with the U.S. Ian Garner is a student of Russia and author, most recently, of Stalingrad Lives, Stories of Combat and Survival. He joins us now from Kingston, Ontario, on the language of this geopolitical moment. Welcome back to the program, Ian.
Hi.
All right, so yesterday was a day of two major speeches, Putin's and Biden's. Let's start with Putin's speech. Of course, a very long one. I believe it was nearly 2 hours. I think it was an hour and just about 40 minutes. Almost a year since the invasion of Ukraine. What did you make of Putin's overall tone?
Well, I thought that the headline message was that Russia is now a wartime state and that Putin is trying to prepare the apparatchiks who were in the audience, there were several hundred of them, senior figures, and prepare the public for a war that might go on for a long, long time. So he made all sorts of promises about education, about compensation for veterans, but also challenged the West and told the public that Russia is almost not really at war in Ukraine. It's in a much bigger conflict, a conflict of civilizations, a conflict that might go on for a long time.
Was there any acknowledgement on his part of things not going as intended originally?
Well, perhaps surprisingly, not really. There were some quiet nods to compensation for people who were struggling. There was a couple of moments of empathy for the scale of the sacrifice that people at the front and behind the lines at home were making. But I would say that those moments were very much lost in this long and quite rambling diatribe about history in this much broader conflict, and of course lost in the news about the nuclear treaty.
Of course, in that rambling, and not surprisingly, Putin condemns the West in his speech. Can you break that down a little bit? He who decided to attack Ukraine claims to be a victim of Western aggression.
So this is something that Russia has been arguing for quite some time. It's not new. The idea is that somehow the West has taken over Ukraine, is using Ukraine as a jumping off point to attack Russia, and that if Russia didn't supposedly strike first in 2022, then it would have been attacked itself. And we saw that message after Putin's speech reiterated by several leading propagandists and on state media.
In terms of perception, and I think the assumption is that this speech was for fellow Russian citizens. How persuasive do you think his speech was for them?
I think in and of itself, the speech was quite unwatchable. Putin is not a great orator. He gives very stilted, tedious deliveries. He speaks slowly. He's not a sort of firebrand speaker that gets people riled up. What this speech does, though, is gives themes to propagandists, themes to state media that they then take and spin out into much more appealing content. So Russians may not be watching this speech, certainly in its entirety, but even chunks of it, but they'll be seeing the materials from it, this idea of a conflict with the West, the idea that Russia is under attack, the idea that we had to do it somehow, then dripped across their social media feeds and across television and newspapers for at least the next few weeks.
I think one of the bigger takeaways from Putin and Russia is that Putin said that Russia will suspend the New START nuclear arms treaty. I'm curious, what does this signal, not only to the West, but the rest of the world, that this is what he's going to do? And what does that actually mean?
I mean, in practical terms, in a sense, it means very little, because Russia has shown itself over the last few years to be an untrustworthy player when it comes to international agreements. So I don't think there'll be any surprise or panic on the part of the USA or NATO about what's happening. Of course, it's regrettable. It's not the desired outcome. But this sort of move will have been factored into their decision-making already. But I think at a tactical level, or a strategic level, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, we've been hearing a lot of talk in the media over the last couple of months about war fatigue. Should Ukraine sue for peace? At what point will Ukraine and Russia be ready to negotiate with each other? But Putin is saying, I won't negotiate with anyone. I'm not ready to make deals because the West can't be trusted.
I'm curious, do you sense that the threat of using nuclear weapons is working in Putin's favor in being able to intimidate Westerners?
I mean, of course, we always have to take this seriously. And this is why Putin has been able to fight this war in Ukraine, which on the battlefield he is struggling with deeply and seriously, and yet continue to provoke, continue to push at the boundaries of what's permissible, and of course go beyond the boundaries of what's permissible legally and morally. However, what is Putin's red line when it comes to nuclear weapons? There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of thrusting and posturing and posing, and yet we haven't seen that the state has really shown any willingness to confront the West in a serious way. Indeed, look back to, you may remember the incident a few months ago when supposedly a Russian missile had landed in Poland, which could have been a big red line. Russia was very quick to play down what had happened there and say this wasn't us. We don't want to go to war with the West over this. And so we have this sort of abstract idea of war with the West, the civilizational clash that Putin talks about in the speech, but he doesn't really want that war because it would mean the end of Putin and probably the end of Russia as soon as nuclear weapons come into the picture.
All right, let's switch gears. Let's talk U.S. President Joe Biden. To the surprise of many, Joe Biden showed up in Ukraine's capital of Kiev last Monday for a 6-hour visit. What difference did this trip make for Ukrainians?
Well, the Ukrainian reaction was just hugely positive. Ukraine is perpetually worried, and possibly for good reason, that at some point that war fatigue will set in, that the West will start to drift away from Ukraine, that America might start pushing Ukraine to make large territorial concessions in order just to wrap this war up for the moment at least. But by appearing in Kiev, while the war is going on in an area that has been under fire, and indeed there was an air raid warning while Biden was in Kiev, Biden is showing very clearly that we've got your back. We're not going anywhere. And he reiterated that point in a speech in Warsaw yesterday.
Well, let's talk about that, of course. A day later, Joe Biden stood in the middle of Warsaw and delivered his own speech. What was your impression in comparison, just as overall quality of speech?
I think the speech was stronger. It was clear that the momentum is with the West. The momentum is with Biden. That Biden is able to choose his path. Putin seems to be kind of backed into a corner. He almost has no choice but to keep going in the war, because admitting defeat at this point would be hugely embarrassing for him on a personal level. Biden, on the other hand, has the choice. Do I choose to support Ukraine? Does America choose to push in a different direction? Well, he's very clearly almost rubbing Putin's nose in it. I can go to Central Europe. I can go to Kiev. You are stuck in the Kremlin talking to these rooms of graying bureaucrats and military figures.
Now, at the end of the day, for U.S. President Joe Biden, sustaining public support for Ukraine among various Western countries is essential. Was the speech of the kind that bolstered public support for Ukraine overall?
I think so. I think certainly in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, it's very clear to the publics and the politicians there where the sympathies of America lie. But the one warning I would have with that is there remains an underlying uncertainty about what will happen in 2024, given the American presidential election.
In terms of your take, what's your sense on how Biden's speech was received by Russians?
Well, they were furious, especially about the visit to Kiev. Almost as soon as he landed, there was an outpouring of rage, of frustration, because the image of Joe Biden in Russia is of sleepy Joe Biden, a man who's aging, who is powerless, who is emasculated, who can't get anything done. And in contrast to Putin, who is meant to be, in the propaganda world at least, this kind of all-action, horse riding, judo fighting kind of macho guy. Well, Putin was the man who was supposed to be in Kiev as the victor almost a year ago. And yet here Joe Biden is striding tall, walking around, looking at ease. And so some of the reaction was not just rage against America, but also frustration with Putin. Frustration that supposedly the full might of the Russian war machine hasn't been unleashed yet, and that actually Russia needs to push even harder in the war.
With that being said, is there any chance that Russians are beginning to see Biden as a leader who will not be intimidated by Putin?
I think there is a frustration, less with Biden personally and more with the lack of disunity in the West. When you read the Russian media and when you see what trends on Russian social media, almost any story about even a minor politician from Europe who comes out in favor of Russia or maybe opposes sanctions, a European Union policy. We hear lots about Republicans on the far right who are opposing aid packages for Ukraine. These things blow up in Russia, even if actually they have very little significance politically in the West.
Final question to you, Ian. Looking at both these speeches, both coming at sort of the time of the anniversary, the 1 year of the invasion here, do we have a better sense of what a victory looks like for Russia?
The one thing that Putin perhaps surprisingly didn't talk about in his speech yesterday, didn't even allude to, is what are the terms for the end of the conflict in Ukraine? What does it mean to win a special military operation versus a war? And what will Russia be happy with? And so I think Russians at some point may begin to be frustrated as the quality of life slowly deteriorates, as the promise of a sort of utopian, united Russia future where Ukraine is subjugated once more to the imperial center in Moscow, none of that is coming true. At what point do Russians stop? At what point do Russians get frustrated? And we might start to see it. However, there is no guarantee that the answer will be that Russians want peace, want an end to the war. They may, as I briefly alluded to a few minutes ago, want to see an even more aggressive war that will somehow wrap things up and will result in an even more destructive series of behaviors on the front.
Thank you, Ian Garner. He is the author of Stalingrad Lives, Stories of Combat and Survival, and the upcoming book, Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth.
Thank you.
Canada set ambitious new immigration targets recently, but numbers just out from Statistics Canada suggest that while Canada may attract plenty of newcomers, we don't seem to be doing such a good job keeping them. Daniel Bernhard is the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and he joins us now for more. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
All right, so this is the story. Immigrants who come to Canada and become permanent residents don't rush to become citizens. So according to Statistics Canada, in 2001, 75% of permanent residents became citizens within 10 years of their arrival. In 2016, that number was 60%. In 2021, that number was down to 46%. Do we know why this is the case?
We don't know. We can speculate. There are many theories, from application fees, processing times, underemployment, isolation, people not being able to have fun and enjoy the beautiful and enjoyable parts of Canada that make life worth living here. But I think the fact that we don't know, actually, for me, is the more revealing statistic, because nobody's really checked. And I think this speaks really volumes about Canada's attitude towards immigrants. We've assumed for so long that since we're not an officially xenophobic country, and because we have such a long tradition of immigration here, and successful immigration, that people will just want to keep coming, and that their lives will just continue to be fine and good, that the future will just be like the past. What this data, I think, starts to reveal is that actually maybe that history of immigration, that legacy of citizenship, is coming undone. The machine is starting to slow down. What does that mean, not just for immigrants' condition here, but about the country and about our future? So the fact that nobody's checked, actually, for me, is by far the more revealing thing. And we're now working pretty feverishly to try and see if we can get to the bottom of this, because the implications for Canada, at least in my opinion, are going to be pretty stark if we can't reverse this trend.
Data, data, data. Very important stuff. In terms of the conditions themselves that you're mentioning, what are they?
Well, I think that we're finding a couple of major trends. So first and foremost, the profile of the typical immigrant who's coming here has changed a lot. So when my parents came to Canada in the 1970s, one had a high school degree, one didn't yet. They spoke very little English. And so, my dad, for example, saw no problem in getting up on Monday morning in Toronto and driving to Belleville, where he worked in a factory, until Friday, and coming home when my mom finished her studies. They had no immediate expectations of home ownership or having a senior executive job or anything like that. Today, of course, Canada's attracting a far higher caliber of talent from around the world, people with higher skills and education, credentials, very advanced job experience. And of course, with that come many quality of life benefits, people who were homeowners, people who had domestic help in many cases, depending on the country that they came from, where that can be relatively affordable. And so coming to Canada, instead of everything being a future possibility and everything looking up, in fact, many are taking steps back and are wondering now aloud whether that step back will be permanent, and whether it's worth it to sort of stick it out and see if you can retain your or regain your status. So I think the caliber of immigrants are changing a lot, and our narrative of who immigrants are has not evolved commensurately. We still have this idea of $5 in your pocket, put your head down, work hard, etc. That was my parents. That was many people. There are still people who arrive that way, but many, many who don't. And until our settlement services, our economic attitudes, our hiring practices can adjust to the reality of who the contemporary immigrant is, we'll continue to fall short here.
I want to stick on the who a little bit. Historically, this has changed in terms of where people are coming from to Canada. Do we have an idea of where most of our permanent, or rather say our newcomers, are coming from?
I mean, India, China, and the Philippines is the short answer. Will make up more than half in any given year. Obviously, it fluctuates. But the origins of newcomers have changed throughout our history. There was, English, Scottish, Irish. Then, we moved to other parts of Europe. Ukrainians, obviously, populated large parts of the West. Now there's people coming from Southeast Asia and East Asia. The future looks likely to be more African. I think that this is part of Canada's interesting history, is our ability to welcome people from around the world, so long as they're committed to their future being Canadian. This is a central core of our identity. We can talk about it perhaps later. The citizenship numbers, in my opinion, are alarming because they call into question whether people are actually committed to their future being Canadian. That's the major disruption that we're starting to observe. In terms of other demographics, newcomers tend to be almost twice as likely as the average Canadian to hold a bachelor's degree. They are, on balance, far younger Half of Canadians are, over 41, and newcomers are, 80% are under that age. So they're younger, better educated. They come with, few brand loyalties and few preconceptions and very rich prospects. So much of our country has been built on putting their talent and energies to use for the purpose of Canada. Citizenship is one marker of that intention to devote yourself in your life.
You had said that the numbers are alarming, and you've once said that it's shocking. But when I read through those numbers, the trajectory has always been sort of moving downwards for quite some time as well. So should it be really shocking or alarming?
Well, it's a 20-year trend.
Right.
I think it's still alarming. Earlier I said, we haven't checked, so we're all kind of a bit surprised. I think what this means, though, is that the contingent factors like application backlogs for COVID, or whether it's a liberal or conservative government, these are not really central here. There's something bigger going on. So I think the bigger thing that's going on is the declining market value of being Canadian. That's what the data are saying to us. Being Canadian is becoming less desirable. That's concerning to me, and I imagine it'd be concerning to many of your viewers as well.
Very interesting stuff. I want to get an idea of how the Institute for Canadian Citizenship is sort of helping fix that. What are the ways in which your institute is trying to make Canada more understandable to immigrants?
So our organization was founded by the Right Honourable Adrienne Clarkson after she left Rideau Hall as Governor General, and John Ralston Saul, the acclaimed writer, academic. And Madam Clarkson's story, I think, is important. I'll tell you why. I mean, she arrived in Canada as a refugee and rose to become head of state. I can't think of another country where that's even legal, let alone likely. And in Canada, actually, I would go as far as to say it was even unremarkable. It was normal. That, I think, says a lot about us, about what we're willing to accept. And if people are saying they'll commit to Canada and being Canadian, that literally anything can happen. And so the Institute was started to keep that dream alive, I think, to ensure that a country that would appoint a refugee as head of state was not a country of the past. Citizenship for me is this determination that this is my place and these are my people. Having the passport is one indicator of that, but it's a state of personal belief, of belonging. And the way that we try to intervene on scale to cultivate that sense of belonging is through a program we have called the Canoe Access Pass. This is really just a fantastic program. It's been going on for quite a while. It used to give new Canadian citizens free entry to over 1,400 national parks, museums, science centers, et cetera, for a family of four, as a way of saying, welcome to Canada. What we've realized, of course, is that many people are taking a long time to become citizens. So about a year ago, we opened Canoe to every permanent resident within their first 5 years of arrival. And this is a transformative, experiential welcome to make Canada easy to love and harder to leave. People are forging connections with each other. They're discovering new hobbies. They're traveling the country. There's very generous discounts from Air Canada and Via Rail. And so this is a way for newcomers to have a VIP welcome to Canada and for all of Canada to participate in that welcome. Canoe is currently being used by over 100,000 people, and that will only continue to grow.
All right. I want to pick up on something that you had mentioned. With the English, French, and Indigenous split, Canada was never truly one thing. With increased multiculturalism, it is becoming increasingly many, many things. Is there a problem trying to explain Canada to new immigrants?
I think there's a problem if you think there's a need to try. Canada has been notoriously difficult to pin down. As we were discussing a little bit earlier, though, I think that this idea of Canada being open to immigrants, not just coming here to live, but to build their homes and their families and their businesses and their futures as Canadian, is actually, in my opinion, the central tenet of the Canadian identity. So there are lots of countries around the world where it's cold, lots of people play hockey, lots of people are nice, lots of people have subsidized healthcare. There's only one agenda, of course. But this idea of allowing people to become citizens, to join your team, has been in the discourse in Canada for centuries. It's originally an Indigenous tradition where Europeans were welcomed here to share the richness of the land. Of course, that welcome was betrayed and We know all too well about that. But that tradition, thankfully, has survived into modern Canada. And you can look at political speeches from, Wilfrid Laurier in 1904 talking about this. Louis Lafontaine was talking about this in the 1840s, about Canada being a place where no matter the land of your ancestors, the land of your future shall be Canada, and that this will be a heritage that we transmit to our children, that their future, like ours, will be Canadian. This is a really central idea. It's in the soil, it's in the air, and it's one of the things that I think makes Canada truly, truly different to all of the other developed countries where this is still contentious. For us, it's central and foundational. It's part of the reason why these numbers are so concerning to me. This is a long legacy of citizenship. If it's being interrupted or questioned, the implications, I think, are perhaps far greater than what people may assume.
All right, I am going to pull up a pretty recent and interesting example of how complicated this country is. We may not assume that this is where this example is coming from, but this is a snippet of Julie Black's performance of Canada's national anthem at this weekend's NBA All-Star Weekend, which was in Salt Lake City, Utah. Let's have a look.
Oh, Canada, our home on a native land.
So there you go, on native land, not and native land. How do you think new immigrants are contending with this part of Canadian history, and whether it's something that they should concern themselves with?
So we held an event in Calgary in October. There's been an event series called the LaFontaine Baldwin Lectures that our organization has hosted for many, many years. And in October, Governor General Mary Simon spoke about immigration and reconciliation. And these things are in tension, as the performance just showed. We wanted to see if we could get to the bottom of it. And one of the things that the Governor General pointed out is, like I said earlier, that actually Indigenous peoples' initial response to the Europeans' arrival was, there's plenty of space here, there's plenty to go around. And the Europeans would all be dead had the Indigenous people not taught them how to survive the winter. It's a harsh place. So this tradition of welcome goes back a long way. There is, however, a danger, I believe, in Canada. If newcomers don't believe themselves to be implicated in that history, then we're going to have an issue. And we hear from people, understandably, saying, look, I get it, but I didn't put anyone in a residential school. I just came 5 years ago. In fact, I came from a country that was also colonized by the British.
Right.
What we found, however, is that that shared experience creates a lot of very interesting opportunities for solidarity. And in Calgary, the Center for Newcomers, along with the Calgary Foundation, has created this program called Indigenous Education for Newcomers. And you would not believe how well subscribed this is. At our citizenship ceremonies, when there's the reception line at the end, the Indigenous representative, typically an elder, gets the most hugs by far. And people understand they have many more things in common than they do apart. But being Canadian is about not only owning our future and coming to get something, but it's also about being responsible for the past. And we have found that newcomers really understand. They understand racism, they understand discrimination, they understand dispossession, they understand a lot of things that Indigenous people understand. It doesn't have to be explained to them. And they are natural allies in many cases. We find that the newcomers we work with tend to be overwhelmingly supportive of Canada's imperative to recover from all the injustices that have been perpetrated upon Indigenous people in the past.
All right. I want to pull to another study. It was a recent Lager study. 22% of new Canadians are likely to leave Canada. Again, I feel like you're going to probably point to some of the same things there. But what do you point the reasons behind it?
So there we asked them a little bit more. And they basically said that the issue was they don't make enough money. They talked about cost of living, but of course cost of living is relative to how much you earn. And we are publishing constantly. We just published a report a couple months ago. There's a new one coming out soon about disadvantages that immigrants, especially highly skilled immigrants, face in the labor market. Like I said earlier, the people who are coming have choices. They've got experience. They come with much more pedigree in that sense than my parents and many past generations of newcomers. And so they have also expectations of being able to find their way here. And if they don't find it, they'll look for it somewhere else. I think this really speaks to the kind of central point of this issue, which is that so much of what we're talking about with respect to immigration is not just about immigrants' condition here. This is not a humanitarian question. I mean, that's part of it. But it's about our entire society benefiting. This is an engine of renewal and growth and new ideas and talent and energy that's been driving Canada forward and driving Canada's prosperity for hundreds of years. We have big challenges in healthcare, for example. In Ontario alone, there are an estimated 13,000 people who have a medical degree from another country. Right. Several thousand of them have already passed their Canadian accreditation exams. We are in the midst of a full-blown global healthcare crisis. And these people are saying, put me in, coach, I'm ready. I want to contribute, I want to help, I'm here, I would love to serve Canada in this way. And we're saying, sorry, but no. We'd rather that people wait in line for years than to have you work in our system, even though you've passed all of our exams and standards. So yeah, what does that mean for the doctor? It's terrible, it's discouraging. But also, what does it mean for us, right, who have this talent and it's willing and able and ready to go, and we're saying, no, we'd rather wait in line. So this is just as much about patients as it is about the doctors, and this example can be extrapolated into every other section of the economy, culture. If you look at our famous authors and athletes, newcomers have driven us as a country so far. I mean, the World Cup team is an example that I use. Canada's star player came as a refugee. When he shows up to work, he literally wraps himself in the maple leaf. He's decided that this is my place and these are my people, and look what we've achieved as a nation as a result of that. So all of us are implicated in this. And all of us are implicated in this. This is for all of us to try and sort out, because it's our common future that's at stake.
So some new immigrants are leaving, some are turning their backs on Canadian citizenship. Is Canada not as great at immigration as we thought we were? And it's not simply being pro-immigration and saying that you're pro-immigration and thinking that's going to resonate with the rest of the world is enough. Are we not good as what we thought we were?
I think that we are definitely not as good as what we thought we were. But I don't think that's irretrievable. There are a few factors, definitely militating in our favor. I mean, first and foremost, relative to other developed countries in the world, we remain still a very positive place for immigrants to come. We're now alarmed to the point where it's current affairs TV worthy to talk about the fact that fewer immigrants are becoming citizens. I've done many interviews about this story in the last couple of days. In fact, my LinkedIn post with this information has been viewed over 230,000 times. And for me, 230 times is a lot, right? So this is really caught on. There are other countries like Germany, for example, where people can live for many generations without becoming a citizen. So relatively speaking, we still maintain an advantage. And in terms of public opinion polling, 70% of Canadians believe that immigration levels are either too low or right. And that includes a majority of people who vote conservative, liberal, every political disposition. That public opinion remains strong. I think the challenge now is how we can translate those values into reality for newcomers, given the changing nature of the people who are coming. And if you think about it this way, we have people who are way better skilled, way better educated, and want to make a go of it here and want to contribute. We have so much more to gain than perhaps we did in the past. Our mindset needs to catch up, though, and I think if that happens, then the reality for newcomers will improve. Their willingness to contribute is unchanged. We just need to catch up with who is actually coming here and create the opportunity for people to contribute to their full potential. And then, boy, we'll be unstoppable.
We have less than a minute here. I'm obviously going to ask you a big question with less than a minute. In terms of solutions, you talk about the mindset. That's one thing, but policies is the other. Those solutions lie with government, both provincial and federal. What do you think needs to be done?
So I think government has a role to play, but I don't want to place too much emphasis on government, because government didn't tell someone they couldn't have a job because they didn't have Canadian experience. Government didn't jack up the price of your rent necessarily. So government needs to, I think, have a plan, first and foremost, about when you arrive, where's your SIM card going to come from? Where's your doctor going to come from? These kinds of things I think could be definitely improved. But all of us, especially employers, I think need to realize, look, people are complaining that there's not enough skilled labor to run their businesses, and yet we have highly skilled immigrants driving taxis proverbially. That labor shortage isn't real, but we need to understand newcomers' potential. And if we do that, we can deploy that potential in amazing ways. That's how Canada's past was built, and I truly believe that our future prosperity will lie in the same direction. All the potential's there. We just need to put it to work.
Daniel, really great having you on the program. This is really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time.
It feels pretty obvious that no one today would think it's okay for white people to put on black or brown face makeup. Yet in both high-profile instances and lesser-known ones, such displays keep cropping up. Cheryl Thompson is an associate professor of performance at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's currently writing a book about the history of blackface in Canada, and she joins us now from Midtown in the provincial capital to give us some insight on where this comes from and why it has persisted. Cheryl Thompson, great to see you again. Thanks for coming on to TVO tonight. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for inviting me.
Not at all. Glad to have you here. Let's start with the broader question. When did this practice of white people putting on so-called blackface begin in North America?
Right. So it really starts in the early 19th century. So we're talking about the 1810s, but it's really in the 1820s, early 1830s, where you have professional people writing songs and caricature, blackface caricature. And in particular, we really locate the origin of this to someone named Thomas Dartmouth Daddy Rice, or T.D. Rice, who essentially created a character in 1831-32 named Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is the first character who's wearing blackface, sort of dancing out a kind of mimic dance of an enslaved person. And he hits the stage and tours the Atlantic world.
And did it become a hit right away?
Yes, it's called instant. Back then, 19th century instant hit means it took about 5 years, right? It didn't happen instantaneously. But yes, by the early 1840s, that Daddy Rice is then mimicked by another group named the Virginia Minstrels, who essentially take his original idea as an individual person and they turn it into a troupe. So now it's like a collective of people in blackface. And then eventually through the 1850s, it's an ensemble. There's 3 parts to the show, and it becomes essentially the beginning of an entertainment industry.
And it's always white people putting on the makeup to pretend to be black people.
Until after the U.S. Civil War.
Okay.
Then it changes.
How about Canada? When did it come to Canada?
Immediately. So T.D. Rice invents this Jim Crow character in 1831 too. By 1836, we have documented evidence in newspapers of a Jim Crow character performing in Ontario, at least. Can't confirm across the rest of the country. So is that T.D. Rice, or is that somebody else pretending to be Jim Crow? Again, I can't confirm that, but we're talking about within a few years. It's in the country.
And they came to be known as minstrel shows, and I wonder if you could tell me how did the Canadian Railroad, what role did it play in minstrel shows reaching out across the country?
Well, first to the name. So just quickly to the name is completely random. I think everyone really needs to understand that. There was a family who were called the Tyrolese minstrel family, and they were from Switzerland. They came to America in the early 1840s, and they just liked the name, so they took the name. So the name minstrel kind of relates to a performer, but it really doesn't have any innate meaning. As for the railroad, the reality is that if we think about how we travel today in terms of how things get here, you need a transportation system in order for people to come to town. In order for large productions to move across borders and space and place, you need to have a transportation system to move them. So once the railroad started to build out, especially in Ontario in the 1850s and 60s, that's kind of the beginning of, oh, now that we have a means to bring in large sets, large pieces of machinery, and large, just generally construction type materials, we can build theaters. We can now build larger sets. So you kind of have the beginning of the infrastructure to support an entertainment industry.
And was the motivation behind it always to pejoratively or nefariously caricature black people?
Yes, I mean, it's just unequivocal. There is really no debating it. From the moment that T.D. Rice puts on blackface, he's actually mimicking a black person that he saw earlier in the day. So the origins of the genre is always steeped in black caricature. As the genre develops through the decades, the narratives expand. There's narratives about slavery. There's narratives about it, freedom-seeking African Americans who end up in the North. There's minstrel shows about that. So literally, it didn't really matter what the show was. The topic of the performance was the black body.
And I mean, obviously, slavery was in effect in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada at the time. So obviously, black people would not have been in a position to rise up and object to this. But do you find evidence through history that they did anyway?
Oh, yeah, no, that's actually not true. Absolutely. As early as the 1840s, you have Black community in Toronto saying, please stop allowing, at that time, it wasn't minstrel shows, but it was the minstrel character who would tour as part of the circus. So they were saying to city council, please stop allowing these minstrel circus acts to come to town. It's causing a terror. There's violence. We feel threatened. And they did this consecutively for like 3 years, 1840, 41, and 42. By 43, they just kind of gave up because the city council just was not listening to them. And by 1849, we have the first theater, at least in the city of Toronto, the Royal Lyceum. Professional blackface is front and center in that theater's productions. So the city didn't listen. And, you know, after that, I think they kind of felt like, what's the point? Because nobody's going to listen to us.
People who know the name Calixa Lavallee will know that that is the author of O Canada, and in French, of course, initially. And there is an association with blackface there as well. What is that?
Well, I mean, Lavallee left Quebec and toured in the American minstrel circuit through the 1850s and 60s. And he did so because he was a very talented musician. He played piano, he could write songs, he did all that in blackface as part of various minstrel troupes in the US. And so I always think to myself, you know, it's just an ironic thing that he also would have been the person to then write the Canadian national anthem.
Does it make you wonder whether, I don't know, should we change the words to the national anthem? Should we get a different national anthem? What do you think?
I don't know. You know Canada and their national anthems or countries in general. I don't know. I don't have the answer, but what I do know is that it's important to understand the roots of everything that we hold dear are probably steeped in some really complicated history of race, of power, of nationalism, and also a group of people at a certain time in history who were disenfranchised, i.e. Black and Indigenous people who didn't have rights to vote, didn't have rights of citizenship, couldn't do certain things. A lot of the things that we still hold dear in our culture were created during those times. So for me, it's kind of having a wider scope awareness of maybe not jumping to right, let's change it, but at least let's have the conversation about where these things actually come from.
Okay, well, let's follow up on that, because you tell me whether we need to make the distinction between the white so-called minstrel shows that were nefariously caricaturing black people and the black minstrel shows. Was there a significant difference, and if so, what was it?
The only difference is that the white actor in the white minstrel show was freely choosing to wear the burnt cork, as they would have called it, makeup, right? Like the blackface makeup. The black actor wearing blackface in the 19th century had to. There was actually a rule. You cannot perform on stage as a black actor in a minstrel show unless you're wearing blackface. That's your options. Until the end of the 19th century, where things start to change through various changes that happen in the North American context. But for at least 30 years, if you want to act and you're a black person, that's your option. And I always say that so people can put it into context and understand, you know, as much as it would have been so freeing to be an actor to go on stage, imagine having to put on the prison of a caricature in order to do so.
I imagine that when you teach this to some of your students, they are shocked. Should they be?
Yes, shocked, appalled. Can't believe they've never heard this before. Can't believe how steeped this is kind of in everything. Like there's certain elements from the minstrel show that I'm describing. You still hear debated in contemporary culture about white artists seemingly caricaturing Black artists, or the issue of race and cultural appropriation. All of those themes that still circulate in our culture. When I teach this, the students are like, "Oh my goodness, now I know where it came from." Like they understand that it didn't just show up in their lifetime. This has kind of been something that has been going on for centuries. And what I always challenge them to think about is, how can we end this? Like, what is the solution to where Black actors, Black singers, Black dancers can actually show up whole and be seen as whole people, not through the lens of a caricature?
Well, at a certain point, these minstrel shows became less and less popular. When did that start to happen?
Well, popular has to be in kind of air quotes.
Sure.
Because it left the entertainment industries really in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, right? So the civil rights movement, the NAACP in the United States had actually been protesting against a lot of racial stereotypes since the 1930s. Finally, in the 1960s, it kind of got wiped from films, generally speaking. Weirdly enough, it makes a resurgence in the early 2000s. Suddenly there were movies with blackface characters. It's very strange. But in terms of leaving the culture, as someone who studies this, it's never left the culture. It's just gone into communities. So it shows up at the community event. It shows up on Halloween at a private party. It shows up now in the contemporary, often on university campuses where people don't know that they're being recorded. So it's kind of moved into a secret culture from what would have been until the mid 20th century, a public culture.
Do you have a theory as to why we Canadians tend to think of this as an American phenomenon, despite the fact that you've pointed out all the evidence that it was an issue for us here too?
Because in Canada, we sort of lack a reflexive understanding about race. So instead of, if there's a conversation about race, it always seems to be externalized, right? It's always about something that happened or something that we saw. It's never about, well, what about you and your history and maybe some of the things that you've done in your past. So because we don't personalize it and it's externalized as someone else, somewhere else, something else, it's when these things happen, that's exactly how it gets handled. It gets handled, oh, that was just an incident, and oh, I'm sure they didn't mean it. We're always meant to understand the intention of the person who's been found doing this, right? To say, understand they didn't mean it. Whereas in the United States, they just erase all that and say it's racist, because it is.
So we should worry a lot less about the intention of the person doing it and just try to get across the notion that this is not acceptable anymore. Yes?
Exactly. Absolutely. 100%.
Got it. Now, you are, I gather, in the process of not only writing a book about this subject, but also working on a documentary on it as well. And I guess I want to know what got you interested in this subject in the first place.
Man, I tell you, if someone had told me 10 years ago that this would be what I would be doing, I would be like, why? Why would I go down this road? I never in a million years ever thought I would be studying this. And it really came out of my first book, which was Beauty in a Box, which is about Black beauty culture in Canada. And because I was in the archive, to be honest with you, I just kept stumbling upon blackface. I was shocked. I had no awareness. I was completely naive about what I would find looking in archives. And so when I kept stumbling upon it, I sort of made a decision, like, I'm finding way too much blackface in the archive to just ignore it. And so, someone said this to me recently. They're like, it seems like this topic kind of chose you. Like you didn't really choose it. And I think I have to agree with that.
Do you know whether any other books about blackface or documentaries about the practice of blackface have been done in Canada previous to your efforts?
No, I mean, I'm going to say it. I think I'm the first. I'm going to be the first in both realms to tackle this topic. Obviously, the book is written engaging with the literature. There's been lots of Canadians who have written about blackface in articles. Stephen Johnson, who I work with at the University of Toronto, he's written articles, done book collections, but an actual full-length manuscript that is trying to tell the story of Canada through the lens of blackface. Yeah, my book, when it comes out, will be the first.
Why do you suppose nobody prior to you has taken this on?
Oh, I mean, first of all, the topic. I mean, you know, let's just say when I first started studying blackface, people kind of cringed when they heard what I was studying. So there's that part of it, because it innately addresses race. Like, you can't not study blackface and not talk about race. And, you know, many people have already established this, and we had this conversation earlier. In Canada, talking about race is always a challenge. So you can imagine now, especially in theater and performance studies, I'm not the first person to find blackface in the archive as a theater and performance studies scholar. I've read books where they talk about it. They actually tell you this show came to town. They talk about blackface, but they don't interrogate race. And I think that's why it has never really been addressed in a full-length book, because you have to address race, and you have to think about power and citizenship and freedom. All these concepts are wrapped up in the minstrel show. It's not just a white person putting on blackface.
Professor Thompson, we can't really talk about this without talking about what happened in this country a few years ago, so you're going to forgive me for going down this path here. I know at the time so many people were mortified when the pictures came out of Justin Trudeau in blackface, but I wonder, with the advantage now of some hindsight, whether or not you think it's good that that happened, because it really did kickstart a national conversation and got people thinking about the topic in a way they might not have had he not done that. What do you think?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think it kind of put me in the map, kind of, because I was doing the work long before this. But when that happened, I sort of became embroiled in a lot of media around the response. So that's good. But to be very honest with you, one of the things that I'm still disappointed about that situation is that he never explained the why. He only said, he admitted it's racist. Yes, I did this, but he didn't explain why. And I think that's where I'm still like intrigued by not just him, but this is why I'm writing a book about this topic. Because if you don't understand the why, how are you ever going to eradicate it? It's one thing to apologize and say you're sorry and admit something is racist, but when you explain why you did it, right, then you get to a sense of, oh, maybe, you know, Justin Trudeau wasn't the only one, actually. Maybe it was a community thing. Maybe he has people in his family who've done. Then you understand the wider breadth of the issue. And I say that because one of the things that we like to do when there's these really sensational moments, we like to make it about one person. So it's like one person behaving badly, as opposed to that one person being a mirror onto our culture and a much deeper issue that's in the culture that is not being addressed.
Well, maybe we should take advantage of this opportunity right now. Again, for the people watching us who I mean, let's just say it, who don't get why this is such a bad thing. Maybe you should explain to them why this is considered so heretical.
Because when the white person puts on blackface, they change. They immediately change. They act wilder. They say things they wouldn't normally say. So in their mind, they're equating blackness with a kind of just frivolity, of just like looseness, being silly, not to be taken seriously. That's what blackface registers. A black person is not to be taken seriously. And so when you put that on and then you don't interrogate why you're doing it, and the fact that maybe on some psychic level, you actually believe that Black people are not to be taken seriously. That's why blackface is not only racist, but it's dangerous. Because now I'm in the workplace with you. Maybe you're my manager, right? Maybe I have to work alongside you. And I have no idea that in your mind, you don't take me as a serious person.
So this is a teachable moment in the history of our country. What do you hope comes from it?
I hope that Black people finally get seen as human. right? The truth is, at the core of racism is a dehumanization of the other. You just don't see them as you see yourself. And if we're ever going to heal, right, and move forward, the truth is you have to start to see people exactly as you see yourself. So imagine, it's almost like putting yourself in the shoes of another. And in order to do that, you really got to think to yourself, what's my power position here, right? So a lot of this is understanding who you are in relation to other people, and then jumping out of yourself and saying, how do they see you in relation to how you see them? And that last part is really difficult. So I say to people who are watching, just try to develop a little bit more empathy and imagine the world through someone else's eyes. And when you start to do that, often people are really shocked at things that they didn't notice until they turn that switch on in their mind.
When do you think your book and or documentary will be out?
Oh, 24. 24 is the year. Okay.
Next year.
I'm excited. Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Until then, point us to a resource if people want to know more about this subject. What can they look to right now?
They can go to my website, drcherylthompson.com. I also created a resource for this very topic. It's called brec.ca. So BREC.ca. If you go to brec.ca, I've literally broken this down into the history, given examples from coast to coast. There's a newspaper catalog that you can access. And I've tried through research to make this topic something that people don't run from because they just think it's racist. Yes, it's racist, but it's also so steeped in our culture. So you kind of have to address both. And so if you go to brec.ca, drcherylthompson.com, there's lots of resources there.
And what does BREC stand for, B-R-E-C?
So that's Blackface Resistance Entertainment in Canada.
Okay, good. I'm so glad we had you on the program tonight, Cheryl Thompson. We appreciate you joining us. You're an Associate Professor of Performance at Toronto Metropolitan University, and we wish you well with both the documentary and your book in 24. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That is the agenda for Wednesday, February 22nd, 2023. Tomorrow, why it's so hard for adults to make new friends. We'll explore that. I'm Jan Jagannathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.